Welcome to Development Talks at South South News. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations doing to assist literally hundreds of millions of people around the world who are suffering from various disabilities? My guest today is an expert on what is going on at the UN and also the issue of people with disabilities. My guest today is Ms. Akiko Ito. Ms. Akiko Ito is the chief of the Secretariat for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Ms. Akiko Ito is also a departmental focal point for women at the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations. Ms. Akiko Ito, welcome to Development Talks at South South News.
Thank you, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. We're going to get into this very important issue of people with disabilities, but tell me a little bit about DESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Just briefly, what is the main mission of DESA? What does it do?
Okay. Main mission of DESA is to promote inclusive society and development. And in order for us to pursue our mission, our department works with governments, civil society organizations, and expert communities to build new partnerships for achieving sustainable development goals at this time.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Now, you work with Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. What exactly is that convention, and what are some of the main provisions of it?
Yes. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the objective is to advance the rights of persons with disabilities in society and development, but it's also a development instrument to advance inclusive society and development for all persons. So it is not an instrument dedicated to persons with disabilities only, but it is an instrument to advance inclusion of all persons in society and development. And there are 50 articles in this international convention, and which ranges from independent living to employment to participation of persons with disabilities in social and cultural development. And this is about universal human rights of persons with disabilities, but through realization of universal human rights of persons with disabilities, we are achieving human rights for all in development.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Now, how does the convention work? Do the various countries of the world, there are 193 member states at the United Nations General Assembly today, do the countries take these conventions back to their legislatures, their parliaments, they debate these, and then they ratify, they adopt them, and then implement them and try to achieve the goals? How does that work?
Yes, as you just said, states parties, we call them states parties, once member states of the United Nations ratify the convention, they are legally bound to implement the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and they have obligation to translate this legal instrument into their domestic policies and programs for actual change on the ground. Even though states parties are the ones that have legal obligation, this instrument was adopted by the General Assembly in unanimity. So in unity. So which means that all member states are guided by this convention, and they all support the goals and objective of this convention.
How many member states have signed on to it? How many have agreed to it?
Yes, right now 154.
154, right. And as I recall, the United States did not, or has not up to this point.
No, not at this time. Right. But the United Nations is a signatory, which actually expressed its political commitment to this instrument.
Mm-hmm, right. As I remember too, there was a horrific debate in the United States Senate. I guess it's been a couple of years ago now, and they were talking about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and very prominent Republicans, Senator John McCain, Bob Dole, former presidential candidate, former leader of the Senate, both were very much in favor of this. Many Republicans were. And then it seemed like there was just this load of misinformation that came out, just disinformation from people like Senator Santorum and various folks like that, talking about the myths of this. They were saying that this was going to undermine sovereignty, it would take children out of charter schools, all of these nonsensical statements. Is that just endemic to the United States, or do you run into that around the world in other areas? Are there very many myths about this that are out there that are under discussion, or maybe we're just unique here? I'm not sure.
I think it is not very easy for an average citizen, or even for governments to understand what this international convention means in relation to what it means for their countries, their policies, their programs. So I don't think it's just one country, United States, or many other countries. I'm sure takes a long process to understand an international convention, not just on disability, but many other issues. But I think the most important part of, let's say, if I bring our discussion to the International Convention on the Rights of, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that civil society organizations and experts from the United States played a major role in drafting this convention. I had the privilege of serving as part of the Secretariat during this drafting process, and United States leaders and also academics and also civil society leaders were instrumental in getting agreement on a number of provisions of the conventions, which is now recorded. You can see in our record of how they really played a major role. So I believe that the experience of the United States and the goal of the United States in promoting inclusive society and development is also reflected in this convention.
Exactly. And as I understand too, a large part of the convention, the language and the provisions were adapted, excuse me, from the Americans for Disabilities Act that was implemented back in the 90s, I guess it was. I can't remember the exact decade, but a large part of the UN document reflected what was already law in the United States. So there has been a tremendous involvement. Excuse me, we'll just cut that part. I'm starting to lose my voice finally at long last. We're talking about people with disabilities. Roughly, do you have an idea of how many, I keep saying tens of millions, but there are probably more than that around the world. How many people are suffering from disabilities, be they physical, mental, sensory, whatever the disability may be? Do you have a ballpark idea of how many people out of the 7.2 billion are suffering from this?
Yes, WHO and World Bank reported that there are approximately 15% world's population have some forms of disabilities. So we use the percentage 15% of the world's population at this time.
So we're talking 800 million to almost 1 billion people. Yes. That drives the point home that with that large number, with 7.2 billion people on the planet, that almost every family either has someone in that family or they know someone who is suffering from some disability. So we're all touched by this in one way or another, are we not?
Yes, definitely. Because when you're talking about individuals with disabilities, their family members, their friends, their co-workers, their community members, other community members, we are all touched by disability. I think in our own lives, if we look at ourselves, we all know somebody with disabilities. We all experience disability at some point in our lives. So this is not about an issue of a small group of people, but it's about our friends, our family members, and ourselves. Of course, when we grow older, now I start to feel it, more and more. But when you're getting older, you also develop disability. It's a normal human conditioning. I think the idea of disability is now changing more rapidly, and I think people gaining more knowledge and experience and sharing their ideas and understanding how to include persons with disabilities in their communities. I think what we have come to understand is that the disability is a human functioning issue. It's not about specific people that has disabilities, but it's part of human life, human experience.
Exactly. I mentioned about the myths that were disseminated during the U.S. Senate debate, but there have been over the years a lot of myths about people with disabilities, and you were talking about the social inclusiveness. Do you see that more and more people and more groups, more and more governments, more and more individuals around the world are saying, well, these people should not be excluded, they should not be housed, they should not be put in some kind of an institution and left there until they die, but should be assisted, and so they can achieve their full potential, so they can be functioning, constructive members of society? Do you see that a lot of those attitudes, stereotypes, and myths are changing?
I think it is changing. It is changing. As we just discussed, disability being recognized as not a specialized group or not specialized issue, but issue that belongs to all aspects of society and all of us. I think this perception of people with disabilities are different people that require help or they need welfare. I think it's slowly changing. Of course, there are gaps between, like what we discussed at the United Nations, in the commitment of the international community to disability inclusive society development, how persons with disabilities are agents of change and beneficiaries of everything we do in society. And between what happens on the ground, there are many people who still suffer from discriminations, the stereotypes, and who actually face enormous barriers between what they can achieve and then what the current status of not being able to have any access to resource in society. So I think our job at the United Nations continues to remove barriers that society sets in front of people with disabilities, so that they can contribute to society, they can find employment, they can enjoy education, cultural experience, just like any of us, and that is the goal of the international community. For all times, always.
Exactly. And whenever there's a disaster, if I could shift gears to that, people who are in the path, be it of a cyclone going through the Philippines or that horrific earthquake that was in Nepal or a Hurricane Sandy or whatever it may be, they're vulnerable to the natural disaster, but disabled people are even more vulnerable in many cases. The UN has been a leader in disaster risk reduction. There's a major conference that was held not long ago in Japan, as I recall. What is the view now as to how to help people who are disabled if there is a natural disaster, and also to bring them in, as you mentioned, be more inclusive, to bring them into the discussion, the decision-making process?
Yeah, thank you for that very important questions. The United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction took place in Sendai, Japan in March, just a few months ago. And this conference was one of the landmark conference in the area of disability inclusion in disaster risk reduction, because there was a commitment of the international community to not just to include persons with disabilities, but to also to view, to see people with disabilities as a resource for disaster risk reduction. And this is already been enshrined in in the Sendai framework, which was an agreement that came from outcome document that came from this conference. And there were a lot of evidence, because I come from Japan, which is disaster-prone country, and as you may know, that we had in 2011 we were struck by this huge tsunami that caused thousands of people, thousands of people die, and there are many people who are still suffering from having not having been reestablished in their own communities. And the evidence actually shows that despite the fact that people with disabilities suffered, of course, just like any others, or more than others, they actually were able to lead communities to safety. For example, in Urakawa in Hokkaido, which was also severely affected by tsunami, there was a group of psychosocial people with psychosocial disabilities who saved their own communities to safety, who actually led evacuation of their own community and successfully saved all community members, because they had been trained in disaster risk reduction programs in their communities, and I think it shows that if people with disabilities are included in the communities and disaster risk reduction measures, policies and programs, training, then they are able to even take the lead and save also their fellow community members. So that was a very important conference to really to have those evidence and brought to the international community, and for the international community to be able to make decision based on that evidence that people with disabilities need to be included, not just because they are vulnerable, but because they can be a wonderful resource for the community for disaster risk reduction.
Exactly. Everybody has a role to play. They can all be participants without a doubt. Now, the United Nations has been in the forefront of bringing together the players and focusing attention on people with disabilities, with health problems, what have you, things like that. And it probably goes back way before 1981, but I remember 1981 was declared by the General Assembly as the International Year of the Disabled. How important was that declaration, and what did it do to spur a discussion of, and perhaps solutions of how to help people with disabilities?
Yes, historically, the United Nations was committed to inclusive society and development from its inception, and the universal human rights of persons with disabilities were, of course, were part of the work of the United Nations. But at the same time, it was not until 1981-82 when the international community severed the relationship from the welfare approach to disability. And by 1980s, there were a number of international human rights instruments which were adopted by the international community, which impacted also on how we approach the rights of persons with disabilities and their inclusion in society development. And the World Programme of Action concerning disabled persons was clearly one of the most important documents of the United Nations. The decision by the international community to say that it is society that places barriers in front of people with disabilities. It's not individuals with disabilities who have to change, but society has to change. Society needs to remove barriers that are placed in front of persons with disabilities. So that was the most important, again, this change and shift, and paradigm shift in the history of the United Nations. And since then, 1993, the standard rules on equalization of opportunities for persons with disabilities was adopted by the international community to focus on human rights dimension. But in 2006, December 2006, the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted by the General Assembly. And this document gave the legal force to the commitment of the United Nations for inclusive society and development, and the advancement of the rights of persons with disabilities in society. So I think there's a history of the United Nations that again, advanced inclusion of persons with disabilities, and that actually also was not separate from again, the United Nations thinking in terms of how to include disadvantaged groups in society, how to advance their rights, how to articulate their rights in a context of broad economics and social development. So there were a number of new thinking in 70s, 80s that influenced the disability field, a disability commitment of the United Nations, which eventually codified in a form of United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has several messengers of peace. He has Dr. Jane Goodall, Michael Douglas, George Clooney he is no longer, I believe, but also Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder was appointed in 2009 as the International Messenger of Peace for disabilities by the Secretary General. How important was that move, and what is Stevie Wonder's role in bringing visibility to this topic and elevating the discussion?
Steve Wonder needs no introduction, so
right.
Exactly. So I think his embodiment of again, our idea of how advancement of the status of persons with disabilities should take place, because he is artist first. He's an artist, a world renowned artist with disabilities. So he's an individual, an artist first, and he happens to have disabilities. But his disability means nothing when it comes to who he is, what he does, and how he expresses himself as an artist. So I think he is one of the very best I think, examples of how we see people with disabilities at the United Nations. And he also gave a very eloquent speech at the United Nations General Assembly high-level meeting on disability and development that took place in 2013, in September 2013. And I thought it was very appropriate that he was one of the key speakers from the UN side to say, look, what we are trying to do is to narrow the gap between your commitment and what happens on the ground. And I am here to also articulate that. And he really, no one, I guess, who is a more better person than somebody like Stevie Wonder to be able to help us carry the message to broader, communities and all of the world.
Exactly right. And of course, we need to be looking at this whole issue of disabilities, not only on World Autism Day or Autism Awareness Day on April 2nd, but also year-round, and to focus on these issues and to become more aware of them and see if we cannot help provide solutions and assistance to people who are in need and do have something to offer. It's very, very important. And our viewers can go to your website at un.org/disabilities, and they can get a lot more information on what we've been talking about and probably many of the things that we did not have a chance to talk about. But Ms. Akiko Ito, who is the chief of the section on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Development Talks at South South News.